Hello and welcome to CookieCast, the podcast that's all about the Cook Islands. I'm John Roberts, and this is the place to meet people who have their own insight into this Polynesian paradise in the South Pacific. Today, though, it's not just an insight into the islands. We'll be hearing the story of a remarkable English sailor who spent 6 years on a voyage of a staggering 48,000 miles, 77,200 kilometres. That's a journey equivalent in distance to twice round the world. And one of the most remote of the Cook Islands became a very special and important place for him on that voyage, after he was shipwrecked and marooned there for nearly a year. To tell us more, my guest, Ros Clark. Welcome, Ros.
Hello, thank you very much. I am very welcomed.
That sailor was your dad, Victor Clark, and to describe him just as a sailor is really not doing him justice. He had a long and distinguished career in the Royal Navy. He was twice awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for gallantry. To me, his history reads like one of the best war movies you've ever seen. Can you tell me a bit about that part of his life?
Yeah, so Dad had actually wanted to be in the Royal Navy since he was 4 years old. That was always his ambition. So when he left school at 18, he managed to charm his way in through interview by his self-professed knowledge of naval literature, which they seemed quite impressed with. He hit a slight obstacle in the health kind of test when it was discovered that he had a hammer toe. So he overcame that barrier, let's say, by having his toe amputated. And
Goodness.
seemingly having 9 toes is okay according to the Royal Navy. So yeah, he got in. He had a very adventurous time when he was in the Navy, of course, because World War II came some years after that. So he was involved in the Battle of Narvik. He was on HMS Punjabi, which had already been hit by the enemy fire, and he braved it below deck to offload ammunition so that their ship wouldn't blow up. And that was what he got one of his DSCs for. He was on HMS Repulse when the Repulse and the HMS Louis, was it? Prince Louis, were hit by Japanese torpedoes and sunk. He was in Singapore and a bomb was basically dropped on him, but not quite on him, to the extent that after he kind of came to from the bomb blast, he stretched out his arm, and his arm was actually in the crater where the bomb had fallen, and actually miraculously hadn't been killed himself, although men very close to him had been killed. I think his second DSC was when he rescued 2,000 troops, Australian troops, from behind enemy lines at night time. He led a group of people in to rescue all these men and get them out. They had to hide in the daytime so that the Japanese wouldn't see them, and then they would continue their mission at night time, going up the river and bringing these guys out to ships at sea and bringing them all to safety. He was involved in guerrilla operations where their motor launch went up in flames, and that was when he was then swimming for 3.5 days with a broken arm in shark infested waters before swimming to land. So you're right, a film could be made out of it, really. And even after that, when he reached land, him and a couple of other survivors were trekking through the jungle and managed to get help from some locals who then actually betrayed them to the Japanese. After that, he was a prisoner of war for 3.5 years before the war ended. So he really did have a lot of very abnormal adventures.
It's pretty amazing that he actually survived all that to go on his voyage around the world in the first place. Obviously, to you he was just dad, but how would you describe him?
Yeah, he was definitely just dad, and I absolutely I didn't acknowledge any of his amazingness until he wasn't alive anymore. I mean, to us, he was old. he was he was 67 when he got married, and 68 when my sister was born, and 72 when I was born. So he was just old to us, and it was quite embarrassing as a child. People obviously used to think he was our granddad, and me and my sister just used to go along with it because it was less embarrassing. But he was old school. He was born in 1908 himself, so he was kind of almost Victorian era. So had a very strict upbringing himself, and kind of that was his parenting style as well. He was also a lot of fun, though. He was retired by the time, obviously, he met mum. So he was a full-time dad for us at home. I used to love playing games with him, and he was really active and fit when we were little. He used to throw us around and play horsey and all sorts of things. So yeah, he was a very hands-on dad. He also would need to withdraw and go to his study and read and write his endless letters. And he was really proactive in life with a lot of areas. So yeah, he was just our dad, but he was seemingly quite a remarkable man who'd lived a whole life before he got married even.
Now, I would have thought after 27 years on ships, he'd have had enough of the sea. So, what made him decide on such an epic voyage? What motivated him?
After the war ended, he was put into the offices in London, naval offices, and that was absolutely not what he had joined the Navy for. So I think he endured that for about five years and eventually just thought, nah, this isn't for me. So he retired from the Navy, and with his money he bought a yacht, Solace, because he was just all about the sea. He loved it. He lived and breathed it. So he was up for his next adventure, and that meant leaving the Navy in order to be able to sail pleasurably as well.
So, what sort of vessel was Solace?
She was a 33-foot wooden ketch, quite simple. I don't think she certainly not compared to what today's yachts are like. She was nothing like that. She was simple. He used to like navigate via the stars and all that stuff, so didn't have all the modern instruments that yachts have now. She's got two masts. She's not big at all. Dad was very meticulous in how he fitted her out according to his needs for sailing around the world. But basically, she was just a smallish, simple wooden yacht.
And he wasn't alone on his travels, was he? He took on board a sailing companion called Stanley Matherin.
Yeah,
And I think
Stanley Maturin. Yeah,
Stanley made history as well, didn't he?
he did. Yeah. So Dad had wanted to sail on his own. It was his aim. He'd actually modified Solace, his yacht, to be a one-man yacht, so he could sail the oceans on his own, kind of thing. But when he got to the West Indies, he was introduced to a young lad called Stanley, who had aspirations to be a captain himself and wanted to get out to sea. So Dad initially said no. He was doing this on his own, but after a bit of encouragement, he said, "Okay, I'll give him a test sail." So Stanley proved himself worthy. So he joined from there on, and went with Dad the rest of the way. And yeah, was I think the first when West Indies guy to sail the world, I think.
I think he was only 16 at the time when he encountered your dad.
Yeah, he was still really young. Yeah.
Ros, I'm looking at a map of your dad's journey and the places he touched on in those first months: the Canary Islands, the West Indies, the Galapagos, the Society Islands, and finally reaching the Cook Islands in October 1954. How did he describe them? Because clearly, reading his book, they were very different from what they are today.
Yeah, I think he was just really struck by how unspoiled they were, really. He described Rarotonga as being like a miniature Tahiti. Just absolutely, he loved the sea, and obviously it's an island, so it's completely surrounded by sea, luscious green, beaches as well, just gorgeous.
But his plan once he reached Rarotonga was to sail to Samoa, calling at Palmerston on the way. And he got a very warm welcome there before things went badly wrong. And that's where his fateful encounter, if I can call it that, with the Cook Islands took place. Can you tell me a bit about how that came about?
Yeah, so they, as you said, they had been very warmly welcomed and taken. The islanders had come out in their little rowing canoes to take Dad and Stanley ashore. And they'd had a lovely couple of days there actually, and they were due to leave the next morning, so had gone back to Solace for a final night out on the reef, or not on the reef but outside the reef. And they had, I think they'd gone to bed and awoken a few hours later to kind of the boat pitching, as he described it. And he went up to see what was going on and realized that the wind had changed direction and they were in the middle of a storm really now. And just as he directed Stanley to go down and get their life jackets and he came back up with them, they were then thrown onto the reef with a massive wave that shattered her side, basically. Oh no, I think actually one of the wonders of it is he said it was the iron keel, maybe that was what smashed against the reef. So that was a godsend in a sense. It could have been worse. So yes, they were on the reef in the middle of the night in a storm and were no longer able to leave the next morning, is basically what happened.
The ship was basically wrecked.
Yeah, she was wrecked. And by the time the islanders then came out the next morning to help assess the situation and see what was going on, and they had to drag her in to Palmerston Island to start seeing what they could do. So by the time she was also then dragged across the reef, I think she had an 18-foot hole in her side. So yeah, it was a big mess.
An 18-foot hole in the side sounds like not the easiest of things to fix.
No, and they had no electricity on the island back in those days, so everything would have to be done by hand, chopping down of trees, and all the absolute skill that they put into mending her, and they did do that. They managed it, and they did a great job of getting her back on the sea.
What struck me is that your dad says in his book, in a way, the shipwreck couldn't have happened in a better place than Palmerston. What did he mean by that?
There is a gorgeous bit in his book, actually. I can read it. He says, so this is On the Wind of a Dream, his book that he wrote about going around the world. I shall never cease to marvel at my good fortune in getting wrecked on Palmerston. If I had wanted to get wrecked and had had the whole world to choose from, I could not have found a better place. Green, waving palm trees, white sandy beaches trimmed with verdant bushes, blue lagoon cooled by the trade wind, no machinery except for the tiny charging motor for the WT batteries, no noise other than nature's, wholesome food in abundance, adequate physical exercise, plenty of boats and canoes for poling, paddling, rowing, or sailing. English-speaking inhabitants, the only island in the tropical Pacific besides Pitcairn, where the principal language is English. First-class boatmen and skilled carpenters and boat builders. Robinson Crusoe didn't do nearly so well, which is just such a lovely, lovely thing.
And getting Solace quite literally shipshape again was a very long and laborious process. Can you give us a flavour of that? What was involved and how did the islanders help?
Yeah, so they chopped down some of their precious tamanu trees, I think it was, and spent many days and weeks and months repairing her. I mean, obviously, initially, like I said earlier, they had to drag her in off the reef, it's not a short distance. And that took days, in the boiling hot sun and blisters from the coral reef and, all that kind of thing. And yeah, just day and night, they were all so dedicated to it. It was absolutely incredible. And, so resourceful, because there's a beautiful little thing whereby they don't have a paintbrush on the island to write Solace back on her after they've, painted her. And so Ned, the island leader at the time, he called over his grandson and said, hey, Eddie, come here. And he chopped off a little bit of his hair and made it into a paintbrush so that they could paint the word, the name Solace back on, which is really sweet.
How fabulous. And your dad, in turn, helped the islanders by sharing his knowledge and skills. Tell me a bit more about that.
Yeah, so he taught them. He did Bible studies and stuff. He was a strong man of faith himself, And he knew, in his spirit that that was something that he needed to do, was inspire them in their faith. So he shared Bible studies and helped write sermons and stuff, and kind of counselled islanders where they needed it or wanted it. And practically, he taught them how to sail and navigate using the stars. And Stanley was also amazing. He helped in the school, Dad and him, but particularly Stanley spent time in the school helping the older students to learn things that maybe they hadn't learnt before. So yeah, they both were put to good use and felt that they were able to give as well as receive so much from the islanders.
Now, there's one story in the book that particularly made me smile, as it did your dad. It was about when he got a letter from his tailor that made it all the way from London to Palmerston. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah. So this was at a time where obviously he'd been wrecked and lost absolutely everything of his own clothing. And dear old, well, she wasn't old at the time, but one of the ladies in Anno, she had hand sewn Dad and Stanley some new sets of clothes. So it was really quite funny that this letter should arrive at such a, a relevant time, really. So the letter was, from Jeeves in London, and it read, so remembering that Dad was now in the middle of nowhere in the Pacific Ocean with no shops for hundreds and hundreds of miles. And the letter read, "Sir, I am glad to tell you that we can supply a real Jeeves suit for you for £30 to £32, including purchase tax. Best quality bespoke tailoring. If you need a new suit, a phone call or letter will bring you patterns by post, but better still, call in and see them and us for yourself. I am, sir, yours obediently from Jeeves Limited."
So finally, he did manage to get off the island, and 10 months, I think it was, after his fateful encounter with Palmerston, he continued his epic voyage. That went on for another 4 years. But even to this day, I think I'm right in saying no one's ever undertaken a similar journey. You must be incredibly proud of your dad.
Yeah, really. I am. He's amazing. He actually, so the next few years, it was like you said, 9 or 10 months until he could actually sail Solace again. But for the next 2.5 years, he was still in that vicinity, because he would sail the young lads that he'd been teaching to sail on Palmerston. He would sail them over to New Zealand and then leave some there to start a new life, or find a career, or put their training, get training and stuff. And then he'd come back laden with goods for the island, and then a few months later take another lot. And so it was really lovely. They then got to put their sailing into practice, what they'd been learning and the navigating and stuff. So it was actually eventually after 2.5 years that he and Stanley properly said their final goodbye and continued back to England after that. But yeah, it was a remarkable thing.
Ros, you yourself have spent time on Palmerston. Uh, was that to see for yourself what it was that your father experienced there?
Yeah, it was actually. So in Dad died in 2005, at the end of 2005, and my cousin now has his yacht Solace. And so he was renovating her, and I lived in Dorset at the time, so I would go over after work and do a little bit of sanding or painting or whatever he asked of me. And I picked up Dad's book again at that time, because it piqued my interest in his travels again. So I was reading it, and inside the front cover, I found a letter that someone had printed out for him once upon a time, with an email, a Palmerston Island email address on it. So I kind of just thought, oh, that would be quite fun. So I emailed it and I said, for the attention of Mama Inanno, because that was the lady that had his best friend Tuakana's wife. Tuakana had died by now. But she was still alive, as I thought anyway. So I emailed saying, I'm not sure if you remember Commander Victor Clark, but I'm his daughter. I'm interested in, his time with you. It was his favourite time of life, his favourite place in the world. Would I one day be able to come and visit and see where he loved so much? And she emailed back saying, yes, of course, my dear, you're welcome anytime. And so very quickly, really, I then planned this trip to go to to fly to Rarotonga, and then there's no scheduled boat, or there weren't when I went in 2011. No scheduled boats. You just kind of waited for a cargo ship to be ready to go. So I had kind of planned a month and a half in Rarotonga to be able to then find a lift to Palmerston and back again, when I would then go on to New Zealand and then back to England. So I did that, and remarkably, I actually ended up staying for 4.5 years, which I never, ever, ever would have gone if I'd known that that was going to happen. Because I love England. I'm quite a home bird. And I probably would have been too scared to get on the plane in the first place if I'd known I wasn't going to come back. But it was just the most amazing time. Yeah, like Dad, really. Neither of us had intended on staying, but both ended up staying longer and loved it a lot.
So you clearly inherited his spirit of adventure. But what did you do for 4.5 years?
When I arrived, there was a dear little girl who hadn't been able to start school yet. She was 8 years old. They had a tiny school on the island, actually about half the islanders. So there were 20 something children in the school, but she hadn't been able to start yet because of learning difficulties. And the staff on the island didn't have the capacity to kind of introduce her to schooling as well. But that's what I'd been doing back in England. So the principal, as they called her, she asked if I would consider staying on. And I initially was thinking, no, absolutely not. It was a tiny patch of sand in the middle of thousands of miles of ocean, hundreds of miles from the nearest other island and any shop or other people group. And I just thought, no way, I couldn't ever do that. But I was actually just praying one evening down on the beach, kind of tossing it over in my mind, because I just wanted to know that I'd made the right decision by saying no. And I really had a conviction that if I was to walk away, then this little 8-year-old might be 9 or 10 before she ever got to start school. And she was desperate to start school. She loved people, she loved her peer group. She really wanted to be a part of the learning atmosphere. And so I kind of just had this conviction from God that it was a Ros-shaped hole that needed filling or could be filled. And so I decided to say yes and wouldn't change it for the world now.
What do you remember of Palmerston? What are your impressions?
Oh, it's just a world away from our rat race here in England. Honestly, we just get so wrapped up in the busyness here. And there is where I really learnt to rest and they're incredibly hardworking, don't get me wrong. Like, when you live in the middle of nowhere, you have to work hard in order to survive. But it's just such a different pace of life and such a loving group of people who absolutely welcomed me like one of their own. I felt like a daughter to Mama and Nano from the minute I met her. And it was just such a special bond because I knew that her and Tuakana had just been so wonderful to Dad as well. She just immediately took me in as one of her own, and it was very touching. But it's just a lovely, slower pace of life and a beautiful community. Yeah, it's very special.
Did she and other islanders have fond memories of your dad?
Yeah, they did. It was really sweet because in the same way that I had grown up hearing stories about them, they had grown up hearing stories about Commander Victor Clark, my daddy. So it was lovely to kind of like swap roles, as it were, and realise that we'd all grown up hearing these amazing tales, and now we were the next generation meeting each other and getting to talk about it.
Your dad said in his book that Palmerston would have an irresistible pull on his heartstrings that would continue until his dying day. As you say, sadly, he passed away in 2005 at the age of 97. But did he still talk about the island in his later years?
Yeah, absolutely. And he prayed for them every day. Like he stayed true to that. He absolutely loved those people, and they literally probably saved his life in a sense. So he just adored them, and he really lifted them to God every day in prayer. And yeah, I asked him to start reading his books to me actually towards the end of his life, because I thought it would be really nice to have him read them to me. Yeah, so that was fun. We used to, every time I would visit, he'd read another chapter or two and we'd chat about it.
Now, Ros, you're following in your dad's footsteps, not by sailing twice around the world, but by writing your own books about him and about Palmerston. So, what are you planning and how's it going?
Oh no, it's really hard. I wouldn't say it's been a process that's come naturally or easily to me, but yeah, I'm excited about the subject matter because Dad was amazing and Palmerston Island is amazing and its people are amazing. So yeah, it's coming along very, very slowly, but it is coming along. And I think it's possibly looking like it might be more than one book, which is the scary bit, which makes it seem like I'm not getting very far. But yeah, one day there will be a book or two or three. I'm not sure. But yeah.
So, two or three. So, what are these all going to be about?
So the first one that I'm close to finishing is kind of like a all like a nutshell story of the whole thing, really, of Dad's incredible adventurous life and then how that led on to me going to Palmerston and kind of my experiences there. And I've intertwined my emails that I used to send back to people to tell them about what life was like on the secluded island. And then the second book that I might do is in a lot more detail. It would be a lot of my diary extracts, basically, because I kept a diary all the time I was there. So it would be like the day-to-day detail of what it's actually like, you know, living in the middle of nowhere, and like funny little characters that people would get to know when, you know, when I'm writing about them. And then the third one would be the equivalent that Dad wrote, but he never published this one. So he did publish two books. One was his Round the World on the Wind of a Dream. One was his autobiography, Triumph and Disaster. But the third one he never published was in more depth of his time, day-to-day living on the island. So I would probably do mine and his side by side in terms of this is what it was like when he was there. This is what it was like 60 years later when I was there.
So, you said you're very much an Anglophile and your heart is in England, but it sounds like there's a little bit of your heart in Palmerston as well.
Yeah, I mean, they're just such incredibly special people. I too just made lifelong friends there, you know, who I will always stay in touch with. Even ones that were children in the school now who are now young adults, we still keep in touch via Facebook Messenger or video calls or whatever. And it's just so lovely. Just such an incredible family, the Masters family. So yeah, 100% they have my heartstrings as well.
Ros, thank you so much for sharing that insight into your dad, his remarkable achievements, and also into Palmerston, which is clearly still a very special place in your heart. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, John. No, it's been an absolute privilege to talk to you. So thank you for getting in contact. And yeah, thanks for letting me share.
I'm John Roberts, and this has been Cookie Cast, the podcast all about the Cook Islands. If you want to explore them for yourself, take a look at cookislands.org.uk, my independent guide to all of the islands. Thank you for listening, and please join me again soon for more stories from this Polynesian paradise in the South Pacific.